Hi everybody. We're going to be doing now a series of 7 lectures on 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. We've already done the first 39 chapters when we looked at the book of 1st Isaiah. Now we're looking at the later collections. In this introductory lecture, I'd like to look firstly at prophecy again. What does prophecy mean in the Jewish scriptures? And then look at the book of Isaiah, connecting the last series of lectures with this series. I'd like then to take a look at the historical background to 1st Isaiah and 2nd and 3rd Isaiahs. And finally, I'd like to introduce to you these 2 latter collections in Isaiah, the one we call 2nd Isaiah, who is an extraordinary figure, and that is chapters 40 to 55, and what we call also 3rd Isaiah, and that is a loose collection of chapters 56 to 66. We're less able to say there was a particular figure behind those chapters. Firstly then, prophecy in the Jewish scriptures. It's a big thing for us to get a sense of that, because it's a very theological understanding we need to grasp. Often we have that simple grasp of a prophet foretells the future. That's not anything to do with what really prophecy is about in the Jewish scriptures. In the scriptures, the canon of the Old Testament, the prophetic books come immediately after the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the scriptures that the Jewish people call the Torah or the law. They tell us about God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, right up to when that promise is fulfilled, when they cross the river Jordan and are about to enter the promised land. God's liberated them from slavery in Egypt, and then finally they come home. In the last book of the Torah, the 5th one, Deuteronomy, Moses is looking from Mount Nebo over the promised land, but actually it's Joshua who begins the next section of the prophetic books when Joshua leads the people into it. So the Jewish people then, as they look at the prophetic books, divide them into 2 particular groups. Each group has 4 books. The first group, which we tend to think of historical books, but they're not, they're really prophetic books, are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They're the former prophets, and then the Jewish people call the next lot the latter prophets, the latter prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and a book they call the 12, meaning the 12 minor prophets. And they tell the former ones, the former prophets, which we call the historical books, tell the story of the way the Jews lost the promised land by disobeying God. This led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish people, the leaders especially, being carted off into Babylon in exile. In the latter prophets, that tells the story of God's judgment on Israel's disobedience, their actual exile, and then of God's promise of salvation, promise of restoration when they return to the promised land. It's so helpful to see the prophetic books from a Jewish perspective, as we get a deeper feel of how the Jewish people understand their story. from God's perspective. We could say, with the inimitable Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, that the prophetic literature, especially Isaiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, is, and I quote, centered on the death and rebirth of Israel, interpreted theologically as acts of divine judgment and salvation. Brueggemann also rather strikingly suggests that the three currents of theology and spirituality which existed amongst the Jewish people immediately prior to and during the exile in Babylon, and when they come back, find their way into precisely those three great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The priestly current of theology and spirituality, which we often call P, with its focus on holiness, is closely connected with Ezekiel. The Deuteronomy current, which we call D, with its focus on the Torah, the law, is very close to the heart of Jeremiah. And then the Yahwist current, which we've commonly called J, with its focus on Jerusalem and the monarchy, is very close to what Isaiah is talking about. It's clear that the latter prophets are the products of a long and much prayed about interpretation of the exile and of the restoration. And it's difficult to discuss each book in isolation, really, as we get only a partial viewpoint. Perhaps it's a bit like doing our studies of Jesus by looking only at one gospel. We need the four to get the deepest sense of who he is. A final word about the word prophecy. In the New Jerusalem Biblical Commentary, Bruce Vorter defines prophecy as not specifically or even principally the forecasting of the future, which is what we sometimes think. That's a fairly late conception of what is essential to prophecy, but rather a mediation and interpretation of the divine mind and will. It's looking at it all from God's perspective. It's understanding history from this divine viewpoint. It's saying it as it really and truly is. It's not just, therefore, the world of politics. It's deep theology, deep conviction. Every age has its prophets. Our age does too. People who can fearlessly condemn all forms of social injustice and offer people in their oppression hope and vision, all in the name of the God who is the God of life. Let's now look a little bit at the book of Isaiah itself. It's a glorious book. It's one of my favourite books. And it's had a profound effect on Jesus, on Judaism itself, and on Christianity. At the time of Jesus, it was the Qumran community, the community of monks. It was their favourite book, their favourite prophet, rather. And we have a scroll which contains all 66 chapters dating from this time. The Gospel writers used Isaiah more than any other book in their attempts to understand Jesus and his mission. It's certainly a must-know book for all students of Jesus and of our story, Christianity. way back in 1892, a fellow called Bernard Duhm, D-U-H-M, D-U-umlaut H-M, published a very highly acclaimed study which showed pretty convincingly that there are 3 different strands in this book of Isaiah. The first strand, chapters 1 to 39, is attributable to that prophet that we call and know his name, Isaiah. He's a charismatic figure who lived in the 8th century BC, at the time when Assyria was the great world power and was threatening Jerusalem. The second block he discerned was chapters 40 to 55, coming from a much, much later period, around the year 545 to 540 BC. At the end of the long period of exile, the Jewish people were suffering in Babylon. And the third strand comes mainly from a challenging time when the Jewish people had come back to the Holy Land and were trying desperately to re-establish themselves. And Duhm calls the 3 strands simply 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah. And they've sort of stuck, those names. Sometimes 2nd Isaiah, of course, is Deutero, sometimes 3rd Isaiah is Trito. Around 30 years ago, however, people started to challenge the neatness of these divisions. Duhm had assumed that each of the strands had developed rather independently, and that an editor had rather cleverly afterwards joined them all together. Nowadays, however, the tendency is to see how extensive really this editorial reshaping has been in moving from the oral tradition, when prophets actually gave their prophecy, their oracle, before the people, to the whole written work. Brever Childs puts it like this: whereas the earlier form critics tended to see the really creative periods lying within the oral stage, later critics have discovered a continuing process of reinterpretation of the written text. All this means it's harder for us these days to talk as though there was only a 1st Isaiah responsible for most of chapters 1 to 39, a person that we name 2nd Isaiah, mostly responsible for chapters 40 to 55, and another figure, Trito Isaiah, for the latter, the 10 chapters. As Charles would say, and again I'd like to quote him, a growing consensus now suggests that the heart of the entire redactional process, editorial process, lies with 2nd Isaiah, whose influence actually reshaped 1st Isaiah into the form we have it today, and largely determined the form of 3rd Isaiah. He goes on to say that, according to some new hypotheses, 2nd Isaiah actually transformed the rather unordered or disordered material of 1st Isaiah by means of a retrospective reinterpretation in order to reflect more clearly the disastrous experience of the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. And 2nd Isaiah sort of is saying, just as God delivered Jerusalem from the Assyrians in 701 BC, at the time of that first fellow, Isaiah, so God will deliver from the great crisis and destruction of 587 BC, God's holy people, and their destruction will be turned into salvation in some way. Second Isaiah becomes the story then of God's restoration of Jerusalem, a story of great hope, great salvation. Death is giving way to life. Perhaps that's the most fundamental structure in the book, and you can see how crucial that is for us. Now I'd like to do a little bit of the historical background to Isaiah, the whole of Isaiah. If you remember, those who've looked at first Isaiah, the original prophet, he was very active during the Assyrian emergency, during the latter part of King Uzziah, who reigned from 785 to 733 BC, so a lot of the 8th century. He was a good king in the interpretation of it, and then came the bad king, King Ahaz, 735 to 715. That's when the crisis is really strong. And finally comes the good king again, King Hezekiah, 715 BC until 687. The kings of Assyria, whose capital is Nineveh, destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC, the northern kingdom, Samaria, and then, of course, King Sennacherib, who was the king of the Assyrians, from 705 BC to 681 BC, laid siege to Jerusalem in 701, after destroying a lot of the Judean countryside and a lot of the cities. So, a dreadful time for the Jewish people. We're going to now, that's the book of Isaiah, the first book, first part of Isaiah. We're going to now jump ahead at least 100 years, and the new power Babylon defeats Assyria around the year 612 BC under a new great king, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from 605, just after this time, until 562. And it's during his reign that he destroys Jerusalem and carts off all the elites to Babylon. And there they stay for the next 50 years. One of King Nebuchadnezzar's successors is a rather feeble king. We don't know a lot about him. King Nabonidus. He spends a lot of time outside Babylon, and he's politically not so astute because he ignores a crucial festivity that happens every year, New Year, the New Year festivities, which honour the god Marduk of Babylon. And in ignoring these, in being outside the country when they're on, he alienates a very powerful priesthood, the priesthood of Marduk. And he also doesn't seem to notice the growing power of the Medes and Persians. And so, it's during his reign, in 550 BC, there's an extraordinary figure that becomes noticeable in the Middle East, and he is Cyrus the Great. He becomes king of Persia in 559, and he reigns for nearly 40 years. Firstly, he conquers the Medes. The Medes, that's a Persian group, with their capital at Ecbatana in 547. Then he conquers the whole of the Persian plateau. He conquers right as far as southern Russia, all during the 540s. And then he takes Babylon itself, which actually isn't destroyed, but they welcome him in 540 BC. It was an exhilarating time to be alive in the 540s. Cyrus was going about liberating so many conquered peoples. And when he liberated them, he granted them religious and cultural freedom. So all the different national groups, including the Jewish people, looked to him for some sort of salvation. And of course, it's during this time that we can fairly confidently locate 2nd Isaiah. So, Cyrus the Great inaugurates the great Persian Empire. And it was the dominant power for over 200 years, from the 540s BC until the 330s BC. One of his successors, not quite immediately but very close to him, was somebody we might know if we know any Greek history, Darius the Great. And Darius the Great ruled from 522 to 486. And of course he battled the Greeks in Ionia, western Turkey. When they rebelled in 499 BC, and Darius invaded Greece itself twice. And we have the famous battles of Marathon and Thermopylae. The relatively small contingent of Jewish returnees to Palestine from Babylon in the 530s faced immense problems. Those who had remained in Israel didn't really give them much of a welcome when they came back. And the Samaritans even accused them of being heretics. There were a lot of economic crises, as drought and storms produced very poor crops. Work on the temple ground to a halt, often. But eventually it was completed by 515 BC. However, the struggling community had to wait a little longer until the great figures of Ezra and Nehemiah started to bring things together and conditions improved. What we now call 3rd Isaiah mainly comes from those first decades, the struggling decades, when the Jewish people came back to the Holy Land. Now we come to the fourth and final thing, our introductions to what we call 2nd Isaiah and 3rd Isaiah. Firstly, 2nd Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55. It's very clear that what we call 2nd Isaiah is quite different. It has a very different feel about it from 1st Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah is much more lyrical, much more filled with hope, a greater sense of joy. We've moved away from the threat and condemnation of Isaiah into a certain consolation. This is the time of liberation, of consolation. And 3rd Isaiah has a sense of, frustration, because it's got the Jewish people trying to re-establish themselves. But it still has, 3rd Isaiah, a lot of visions, new visions for the human family, which includes, of course, the Jewish people. Isaiah, original Isaiah, 1st Isaiah, challenged the people of his day for their self-confidence, their materialistic attitudes, their very comfortable lifestyle. In 2nd Isaiah, 150 years later, he spends his time encouraging a people who are discouraged and destitute as they're about to come back into the promised land. 1st Isaiah is facing the Assyrian threat and the elite's response, which is very politicized, whereas second Isaiah is responding to a totally new situation, the collapse of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of that superpower, Persia, an event that generated so much hope and excitement everywhere. A little bit like, I think, the days surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Empire, when so many peoples of its former empire were filled with a sense of hope for a better future where freedom was paramount. In the original Isaiah, the foreign nations are perceived as instrument of God's punishment of Jerusalem, whereas in second Isaiah, they become the means by which Jerusalem will find salvation. Indeed, Jerusalem is called to reach out to all these nations. Today, scholars have come to see that second Isaiah was very different, therefore, from first Isaiah. And second Isaiah is really very different from the prophets of first Isaiah's period, Amos, Hosea, because they spent so much of their time delivering oracles, giving their prophecy out to people. Whereas in second Isaiah, we see a lot of literary composition, and it cleverly weaves into the text a lot of references to first Isaiah. So we've moved from a world of delivering prophets to people into a more reflective style. We're looking at all the text and we're seeing how God has moved Isaiah and is moving us today. However, we can't just say he's a literary figure. He's a great prophet as well, because he very clearly is able to see and interpret for us what the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 and what the restoration really means in God's sight. Our church uses second Isaiah 30 times in the liturgy, especially during the Christmas season, Advent, and a little bit at Easter, and on some Sundays during the year. Think of these passages, for example. A voice cries in the wilderness, "Prepare a way for the Lord, make straight his paths." Think of this. "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have endowed him with my spirit. He does not cry aloud or break the crushed reed." And perhaps a final passage. "O come to the water, all you who are thirsty, though you have no money, come," etc. It's magnificent, and we're going to really gain a lot from second Isaiah. Now just a brief introduction to third Isaiah, chapters 56 to 66. There's a Dutchman who has written some fabulous work on the prophet Isaiah. A little bit has come into English. His name is Wim Boyken, and he suggests that the great servant figure, which we're going to find in second Isaiah, has become a figure of the past by the time we get to the times of third Isaiah, and that he now lives on in the righteous conduct of his followers, whom he calls servants. He says that the fate of the servants is intimately tied to the destiny of the city of Jerusalem. And yet the struggling community, really, it's being worn down by struggles within this community. So we're going to see a fair bit of that when we get to third Isaiah. In chapters 60 to 62, we hear about the extraordinary destiny of Jerusalem. Arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. That glorious passage that we read in the liturgy. Some of the more traditionalist commentators see a significant difference between the world of 2nd Isaiah and the world of 3rd Isaiah, which they say does reflect the returnees from Babylon trying to establish themselves. And I think that's pretty valid myself. The newer approach is to see perhaps a little bit closer continuity between the thought of 2nd Isaiah and the thought of 3rd Isaiah. As Childs puts it, the 3rd Isaiah remains in close narrative continuity with 2nd Isaiah, in prophesying new things, salvation, coming back, etc., into the Holy Land. New things which God is doing, which are about to unfold within the great plan of God. We are more conscious today that an extraordinary editor or visionary prophet has ultimately taken charge of shaping the entire Isaiah corpus. We've mentioned that so much goes back, however, to 2nd Isaiah, who probably reshaped 1st Isaiah, but ultimately somebody else has put everything together. And that person can clearly see the profound link between chapter 1 and the final chapters 65 to 66. He's responsible for that extraordinary link. From the way 3rd Isaiah has picked up and used brilliantly themes from 2nd Isaiah, such as the inbreaking of a new age and the contrast between new things and former things. However, the great hopes for restored Israel in 3rd Isaiah are not placed on Cyrus the Great and the glorious homecoming, but rather now they are seen as, well, they were wonderful for us at that time, but our hopes sort of were dashed a little bit. Things got hard for us. And so now our hope has to be in God. The God who will give us and restore for us a new heaven and a new earth. And God will come to us even as we toil in things that are so hard for us to accomplish. So we begin a great journey today, where the thought and vision of original Isaiah is brought to bear upon a new world. After the judgment that Isaiah passed on the elite of his day, comes the salvation promise to people who have experienced the tragedy of the destruction of Jerusalem and exile. And in 2nd Isaiah, the time of exile is over. God is going to do new things and bring salvation to his people. After death comes life. 2nd Isaiah went back to understand his times to the work of the original Isaiah and used that. He reshaped all that came to him from Isaiah so that he could understand from God's perspective what the disaster of Jerusalem and its destruction really meant, and why Cyrus the Great is the mediator of God's salvation. A generation later, the editor prophet gathers further material together and combines the whole book into an extraordinary prophecy, which so powerfully speaks of the hope we're called to have in God's plan for us and for our world. Thank you. My favourite book has been by Brevard Childs, called Isaiah, 2001 comes out. Another book I've really enjoyed reading is the New Interpreter's Bible, Volume 6 from 1994 on Isaiah. It's by Christopher Zeitz, S-E-I-T-Z, and that's called The Book of Isaiah 40 to 66. Those two have been very, very helpful. Then there's Joseph Blenkinsop. He's got a book, Isaiah 40 to 55, from the Anchor Yale Bible series, and another book, 56 to 66. Then Karol Stuhlmuller has got his commentary in the New Jerusalem Biblical Commentary, and it's called Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah. And John J. Collins, a book called Isaiah, which is the one that's used in the Collegeville Bible Commentary. Should also add the final one, Klaus Westermann, Isaiah 40 to 66, and it comes from the Old Testament Library. Thank you.